Well, on the show today, we're asking, do faith and politics mix? Tim Farron and Polly Toynbee join me today for a conversation on religion and public life. Tim Farron is MP for Westmoreland and Lonsdale and a former leader of the Liberal Democrats. In his recent autobiography, A Better Ambition, Confessions of a Faithful Liberal, he tells the story of leading the party during the 2017 election campaign, during which his Christian beliefs came under scrutiny. After the election, he resigned leadership of the party, saying, "I seem to be the subject of suspicion because of what I believe and who my faith is in." In which case, we're kidding ourselves if we think we yet live in a tolerant liberal society. Polly Toynbee is a well-known political commentator and columnist for The Guardian. A most recent book co-authored with David Walker is The Lost Decade, 2010 to 2020, and What Lies Ahead for Britain, which dissects the good and the bad and the last 10 years of politics and society in the UK. Polly is a vice president of Humanists UK and an outspoken critic of religious privilege in the public sphere, and says she may be glad to see its influence waning in the UK and the West, but we'll let her talk to that in a moment's time. So what role should Christian belief have in public life? Should religious MPs leave their faith beliefs at the door when they enter the debating chamber? Or is it illiberal to exclude those whose personal views don't necessarily comport with mainstream morality? What about the values and cultural capital that Christianity has ceded in the UK and the West? Or could we get on quite happily now in a secular society without it? So looking forward to the sorts of questions we'll be covering in the show today. So Tim and Polly, welcome along to the programme.
Hello.
It's great to have you both. Tim, we'll start with yourself. Just briefly, how has lockdown looked for you? I know that you've actually succumbed to what you think might have been COVID-19 for a while, didn't you?
Who knows? Not tested, but the nice chap at NHS 111 and my mate, whose friendship I abused, who's a GP, are aware of common view that I did have it, a relatively mild version, but I was kind of wiped out for a couple of weeks, really. I think that was probably beginning of April, but I'm absolutely fine now. I've been out running throughout May and just been out running now, so I'm okay, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, that's good to hear. What about your constituency? I'm sure it's having quite an impact there.
Yeah, I've always taken the view that at least 3/4 of your job as a constituency MP should be actually in and rooted in your patch. It's where I live. I kind of collect the ammunition, if you like, whilst I'm here and fire it when I'm in London, if a rather simplistic way of putting it. But I think that, we have a huge caseload here anyway. We make the argument for being Britain's busiest MP's constituency office, and our workload went up 5-fold in the first fortnight and has settled at just double the normal caseload. And it's not just the volume, obviously, or even the complexity. It's that we're talking about people who've gone from comfortable to desperate in the space of a few weeks. And so you are dealing with and trying to help people whose businesses have collapsed, whose work have ended, who are having serious potential issues on a domestic level, and obviously those who worked in health and care, who felt at risk. And indeed sometimes have been at risk, and at this desk I'm sat at now, I write condolence letters every day pretty much, and you get the sense of this being a colossal human tragedy with long-running consequences, many of which we can yet predict. And if politics is all about service, and in my view that is exactly what it is, then there's never been a more important time to be in it, so it feels a privilege to do it. But it is these are challenging times, and I guess relations with government, with Westminster, how you can challenge ministers is all the more important, which is why I think that we need to do something better than the current arrangement for Parliament at the moment during a pandemic, when we're all forced to turn up in person.
Right. Yes. Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? How to run the country remotely. But yes, if you've got the opportunity, I suppose you should set the example. But before we come to you and your book, I just want to say hello to Polly as well. What does your work look like in lockdown, Polly, so far?
Well, what I most like about journalism is going out to places, seeing people, meeting people, going to constituencies, finding out what's happening on the ground. And that's the one thing I can't do. I'm locked in for the time being. On the other hand, the advantage is that everybody's home and you can ring up all sorts of people and they can't say, oh, well, actually he's away in a conference in Gibraltar or whatever. And they're all there and they can't really escape. So people are more, important people are more accessible. Ordinary people, alas, not at all.
And which has played to my advantage with having you both on this call for today. And you might have even heard my doorbell go, which shows that we're all in the same boat here. We're all doing this from our homes, and there's a sort of charm to it as well. Actually, I've enjoyed actually being able to get in touch with people in this way. But obviously, it comes with its frustrations. Look, I want to find out about these books that you've both relatively recently released. Now, Tim, yours came out actually last year, A Better Ambition. It sort of tells both your political conversion and in some way your religious conversion as well. They sort of both happened around the same time when you were a young man. Do you want to kind of describe that process on both fronts?
Well, you should be really, really nervous and suspicious of neat testimonies of any kind, because the reality is they're all higgledy-piggledy, because we are, higgledy-piggledy people. I joined the Liberals at 16. I always put it down to being moved to tears by watching Cathy come home when I was 14. And the more I think about it, as I wrote the book, it struck me, so I watched Cathy come home, it broke my heart. I went and spent £1.50, 3 weeks pocket money on a postal order and joined Shelter. That was the first political thing I did. But actually, I think, looking back, the reason why it had the impact on me it did was because about 3 or 4 years earlier, so we lived in a 2 up, 2 down sort of terrace just outside Preston, and my mum's mate split up with her husband and brought her 2 daughters to live with us for 9 months in a 2-bedroom house. And I remember thinking most of the time this was massive fun, because my sister's a bit boring, she's not, she's lovely, but, a bit boring. And suddenly there's more children in the house. It's fantastic. And another adult to play off, which was great. And actually the penny dropped with me after watching Cathy come home, was that was basically what we'd spared my mum's friend. And that this was a real issue. And I guess I felt utterly heartbroken by it, but I guess I also felt angry at the fact that there were people in positions of authority in that play, but a play, every bit of it based on real things that happened in the UK that year, 1966, repeated in 1984, I hasten to add. And it was, so there was the empathy and the sadness about Cathy's position, but actually it was also about anger at people in authority who did naff all to help her. And I think those things made me want to do something about it. I ended up doing the Liberals for all sorts of reasons. Probably just because I'm an awkward kid. The Tories were the establishment, and in Lancashire Labour were local establishment. So I'm not having none of that. And I've always been an awkward kid. But bluntly, I became a Christian at 18 to my total and utter surprise, because it struck me that it was true. And if it was true, then my opinion of it almost didn't matter. But I became a Christian then. I did not become a perfect person. Lots of ups and lots of downs. I pretty much backslid through the bulk of my 20s. But I believe Jesus Christ to be who he says he is in the Gospels. And I think the evidence is sufficient there for a thinking person to put their trust. And that's all faith is. It's trusting somebody or something.
Great. Well, as I say, you tell the story very well on both fronts in the book. Obviously, your political career went on from that point. Did you find as you entered the world of Westminster that others shared your faith, or what does it look like in terms of the numbers who are actually believers in politics?
Quite a number. I was on Bible study Zoom this morning with MPs from other parties, and normally the one I go in on a Tuesday morning is me, Labour MPs and 1 or 2 SNP MPs and 1 or 2 Conservatives sometimes as well. There are plenty of Christians in Parliament. I think something that occurred to me. So I talked about backsliding in my 20s. I probably unbackslid only about 2.5 years before I got elected. And so I was quite fresh in the sense to thinking about these things from a Christian perspective. This is a natural thing to think as a liberal, but I think it's important all the same. it's very, very clear to me that the job of a Christian in politics is not to make people who are not Christians live as though they are. It's not to legislate in a Christian way, so to speak. But it is about, setting an example, treating one another with grace, and I mean all people, not just those who come to believe what you believe. Accepting a level of humility, understanding, I think, that in the context of eternity, our achievements here on a personal level are relatively unimportant. And one of the, I guess, subplots of this fascination we have with statues at the moment is this fascination of us all being remembered. Why bother? We're not going to be. Tim Keller was saying something the other day about how many of us can remember the names of our great grandparents. Well, actually, I've got a family portrait up there which has my great grandparents on them, and I can't remember their names. I've tried quite hard. So, and when I first got elected in 2005, it was all about Tony Blair leaving a legacy, and it's all pointless because we'll be, broadly speaking, forgotten in a human sense. And it's and so I guess all those things have an impact upon your recognition that you need to be humble about what you're doing. Your job is to serve, and as a Christian, it's to please God, and you please God by your humility and by your service and by your grace and treating others as you would wish to be treated yourself.
Great stuff. Let's talk about your recent book as well, which only came out, I think, really during lockdown, didn't it, Polly? The Lost Decade. An interesting time for anyone to be publishing a book, especially a book in a way that you don't recommend it. Talk to us though about the general thesis of the book. You're obviously taking the last decade, 2010 to 2020, and really dissecting it, as I said. What were your broad brush conclusions about what's happened politically and socially in the last decade?
Well, this has been a decade when we have lost so much. Public services have been shredded, whether it's the police, whether it's the army, whether it's social services, local government lost 40%, health service utterly depleted, left totally unprepared for the disaster or any other disaster that might have struck. I think the advantage, perhaps, if there's any at all, is that people realise now quite how important all our public services are, all depending on each other, quite how valuable our public servants are. Wages have fallen and wages at the top have risen. It turns out recently emerged statistics is that inequality did grow in those 10 years. It's been a very hard time for a lot of people. Now, we had the advantage that we'd written a book called The Verdict, which came out in 2010, which was the verdict on the Labour years. And we looked through all they'd done, for better, for worse, whether it was the Iraq War or whether it was 3,500 Sure Start centres, nearly all of which have gone now, in effect. And we had a comparison to make then of what things had been like in 2010, where we'd done our audit then, and we could do our audit again 10 years later. Sorry. And also, we'd been to talk to a number of people for the verdict. And we went back to see a lot of those people again to say, all right, we saw you in 2010. How's the decade been for you? People in private sector all over the country, different walks of life, different occupations, and could talk to them again. So it gave us some real grounding in what was happening in people's actual lives. And I think a lot of people found this decade very, very hard indeed. I mean, nearly 1 million public servants lost their jobs. They may have found their jobs again because there were plenty of jobs around, but they were jobs as security guards, as checkout, as cleaners, as gig economy work, new jobs of the sort of Uber, Deliveroo kind. They were not secure or well paid as the jobs that had been lost. Also, the value of the work that had been lost. So mostly this is, on the other hand, there were good things too. It was a great decade for the arts, but nearly all of that was the seed corn of the years before. Investment in the arts, public investment in the arts had been cut greatly because local government had no money, and the Arts Council was cut by a third. But nevertheless, there was a great flowering of the arts. How long that will last? Well, we don't know now as everything has closed down. But I think this was a good, as we published the book just as we were going into lockdown, you could say the virus couldn't have hit at a worse time when we were less prepared in all kinds of ways.
Yes, I was going to say, to what extent do you feel that that decade led up to the way that the coronavirus crisis has been handled? But obviously, I'm sure you would say, as you say, it's made it far more difficult in some ways. I suppose the austerity is something you specifically focus on a great deal. You say the Tory government was heedless and needless in the way it handled austerity. I mean, we've got obviously the former leader of the Lib Dems here, who, of course, that policy began under that coalition with the Conservatives. Do you see them as having partial blame for this as well as the Conservative government, in your view?
Possibly Tim Farron less than some of them, but I certainly think Nick Clegg made some serious errors. He didn't get all he could have done out of it. He didn't put his foot on the brake sufficiently over austerity. Above all, he didn't do the one thing that Lib Dems should most always do when in coalition, which is to secure a change in the voting system, so that we don't have this crippling voting system that leaves us with two big parties, one extra little bit, and no choice for people. And I think in the last election, particularly, people felt the choice was terrible between Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, and a collapsed Liberal Party. It was the one thing he should have absolutely got from David Cameron in that famous Rose Garden wedding between the two parties. So I think they colluded with a lot of things that went against their own grain, wasn't really who they were, including an appalling destruction of the health service and fragmentation of the health service. But I think probably almost a few Lib Dems remaining have learnt the lesson and would be people who wouldn't do things that way again.
What's your view of Polly's assessment of the last decade, in your view, Tim?
I mean, I wouldn't disagree with much of that, really. I think that it's worth saying that I think that what the Liberal Democrats did in May 2010 was to join with both Labour and the Conservatives at that point in accepting economic orthodoxy, whilst perhaps forgetting what the consequences might have been. I think we were right to go into coalition, but I'll ask myself now, I sometimes wonder, we had no alternative to put Labour in instead. The maths just weren't there for that. And Labour didn't really want to either. And on top of that, I guess our options were some DUP style supply and confidence, where, I'm not sure we'd have got much out of that, or to sit on our hands and let there be another election in the autumn, which, at the time, it felt like Cameron would just win that. And that was the judgment that I made. In fact, in the end, I think I took the view that you should, you don't join the Liberals as a career move, but if you do it to avoid being in power, there's something wrong with you. And so you have to take the opportunity when it comes. But I agree, we made a lot of poor decisions. So a lot of the policy was great. I thought the politics was terrible. And I think that fundamentally the decision to restrict spending on, massively reduce spending on capital at the beginning of the coalition was really foolish. And actually Nick said that since. And I think it is a shame. I tell you what, I have no particular dog in the game here at all, dog in the fight here at all, but an observation as we've had Brexit and all the febrile nature of British politics. And it's not why I entered the Lib Dems or anything like that. However, the Liberal Democrats being in government robbed the electorate of a safety valve. And there was somebody to vote for against the system that wasn't packed full of wreckers and racists, basically. And the danger is that once you've got to a two-party system, which is where we kind of were when you had two parties in coalition and then a Labour Party in opposition, if you didn't like either the government or the opposition, your options or people's options very often became pretty ugly and extreme. And so I do think that we've that was a consequence. But I think that that we are in a worse place to tackle the coronavirus because of the way that public services have been underfunded. I'd say mostly stunted rather than shredded, but actually local government feels pretty shredded, and therefore social care. And of course, that's been right at the front line. And I think we've got to take, me included, our share of the responsibility for that. I think that this feels, let's be positive about things. It's quite possible that we don't overdo the war analogies, but this is a kind of 1945 moment where people will feel the desire, to coin a phrase, to build back better, to do things that we would have thought were too radical 6 months ago, actually might be thought of being perfectly sensible now. Minimum income, what we might do with social care, bringing lots of it back into the public sector. 90% of our care homes are owned by the private sector, many of them, offshore. And we've got to ask ourselves whether that really is how we want to care for the vulnerable people in our country in the future.
Thank you very much, because I do want people to go and check these books out. A Better Ambition from Tim and The Lost Decade from Polly. That's co-authored with David Walker. And I'll make sure there are links from today's show. So do go and check out the info from today's show, wherever you're watching or listening to today's programme. But we want to talk about faith and politics as well in the course of this. Now, that doesn't feature massively in your own book, Polly, though I will read out a passage at one point where it talks about the eroding effectively of faith in British culture during the book. But generally speaking, obviously, how have you viewed the sort of marriage of faith and politics in the UK? Have you generally seen it as fairly benign, or do you have serious concerns about some parts of that?
I think I have serious concerns. There are many more religious people in the Commons and in the Lords than there are in society in general. As a result, certain things that I regard as incredibly important have been blocked by the religious lobby. And the last great issue, I think, is the right to die with dignity, the right at the end of your life to say, I've had enough, and to ask a doctor to ease you out of life at the time of your own choosing. I've seen my own mother die in agony of cancer, probably 3 months longer of suffering than she wanted, begging the GP. He said, well, after Harold Shipman, we can't do anything at all. We can't help in any way. And others of her friends too. I think the right to control your own body is very important. But time and time again, despite for many, many years now, 80% of the public believe that we should have that right, it's been blocked in the Lords and blocked in the Commons, and mostly by an organised lobby of the religious. And so I resent that. That's a very different issue to somebody like Tim having their own passionate, personal, private beliefs about belief systems. We all have our own belief systems. Many of them are idiosyncratic, whether we're formally religious or not. We are mostly not very rational beings, though we like to think we are. So that's not a problem. It's only a problem where belief in some ancient text or law written down in prehistory times is suddenly converted into what ought to be our law because it says so in those books. And at that point, when it actually influences the decisions made about how we all live our lives, that's the point at which I think it oversteps the mark.
Right. Tim, interested in your response to that, and to what extent, the writings of the Bible do shape what you then go and do when you're in Parliament.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is I strongly oppose privilege for any faith of any kind whatsoever, and support the Church of England. There's lots of really good work, and the bishops in the Lords are sometimes some of the sanest people in there. But that doesn't change the fact that I don't think any established religion or belief system has the right to kind of primacy. And I also think it's wrong from a Christian point of view, by the way. Not only is there no value in forcing people who are not Christians to live as though they were, actually I think it's counterproductive. And so we have to be really careful about that. But from a liberal point of view, I oppose that. But I also think that the reality is everybody has faith. Everybody trusts in something. And it isn't black and white. There are some who take their worldview from an ancient book, and some who are, thoroughly modern and have their views formed in the now. The reality is we all have a worldview. We are conscious about some of it and not conscious about other bits. We're conscious about the sources of some of it and not so conscious about some of the other sources of it. So I think the notion that people with a faith for me, a Christian faith, it absolutely is based upon what the Bible teaches, that we should leave our worldview at the door before we enter the room or the parliament. Yet people who take what they believe from the pages of, Das Kapital or The Economist are able to take theirs with them, I think is nonsense. I think that particularly when you think that there is a sliding scale of belief when it comes to the supernatural, and many religions don't really have a book at all, or even believe in a specific God at all. And so I think it's not, if we're thinking of a church legislating, I've been reading some of the great C.J. Sansom novels, and you see some of the awful kind of clerical wickedness of those around, and including Henry VIII and what have you. People have in their head that kind of imposition. And I hear what Polly says about dignity in dying. I mean, I think that I oppose euthanasia, and not absolutely black and white. It's an on balance. And is it informed by my sense that there is a dignity in human life from start to beginning, as someone who also saw his mother suffer dying from cancer? I think it is informed by that, but I think that's okay in the sense that people are informed by their politics, by their ideology, and a whole range of other things. And if we're talking about something which is totally self-regarding, then that's one thing. If it's something that has an impact on society as a whole, then it's different. I think it's wrong to say that people can't take their consciences with them into the room.
Well, we'll come back to this in just a moment's time. I'm going to go to a quick break first, and we're talking on faith and politics on Unbelievable today. Tim Farron and Polly Toynbee join me for this conversation on religion and public life. Again, links to them both and their books as well from today's show. But do join us again in just a moment's time as we continue the conversation.
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like putting it like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were too much like us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
We're talking about faith and politics on today's show. Not something we often address on Unbelievable, but I'm really glad to have with us Tim Farron and Polly Toynbee to do it today. Tim Farron, of course, is an MP for the Liberal Democrats and a former leader of the party. His recent autobiography, A Better Ambition, tells the story of leading the party during the 2017 election campaign. And Polly Toynbee, a well-known political commentator and columnist for The Guardian. Her new book is called The Lost Decade, looking at the 2010 to 2020 decade and the ramifications of it for today. So we were just saying there in that last segment, Polly, you said you're concerned about the power of certain religious lobby groups when it comes to issues like euthanasia and so on. Tim says, well, hang on, I personally am not for euthanasia, but that doesn't just come from my religious beliefs. I'm a composite, if you like, of a number of different things, as we all are. I suppose your concern, it sounds like, though, is that Tim's view isn't adequately represented in the larger society. In fact, you have there's a segment in The Lost Decade which starts like this, that in 2010 to 2020, God kept on dying. The 2019 British Social Attitude Survey shows a remarkable rapid decline in all religious belief. Half now proclaimed themselves non-believers. Hymns no longer featured in the top 10 musical choices for funerals, a list topped by My Way and followed by Ed Sheeran with the mawkish Supermarket Flowers. The old saying about Scottish Calvinism was now completely inaccurate. 59% of Scottish residents identified as non-religious, rising to 70% among those aged under 44. You go on to say Anglicans like Theresa May at 12%, Roman Catholics 7%, some 25% now boldly stated, I do not believe in God. So you've set out the sort of the statistics there in the book. And should these be statistics that inform how much airplay, if you like, faith gets when it comes to politics as well? People like Tim, should they, in a sense, are they overrepresented in your view in that sense in Parliament?
Well, they are overrepresented, but I wouldn't want them removed. They stand for office. They are selected by their party. They're elected by their electorate. And if you're a Lib Dem, that's a big struggle. And you can pronounce your views or not. I mean, I think you're at liberty to keep your religious views private, except where it comes to issues of this kind, where I think that the religious should declare that it is the view of their particular religion. And although Tim says he comes to his view about dignity in dying independently, there's an extraordinary confluence between people with religious belief and people who have blocked this particular legislation for which there's been such strong public support for so long. So I don't think one wants people to be duplicitous about it, but I don't see any reason for not voting for somebody because they're religious, but I wouldn't vote for somebody who was trying to obstruct other people's freedoms. Other people's freedoms on abortion, on contraception, on end of life. I think those things are all things that where we have individual rights and power. I think the reason that Tim ran into trouble is that he joined a party called the Liberal Party. If he'd been a Conservative, his particular views on abortion, on other things, would have been okay. It would have been much easier. But the Liberal Party has been, at the forefront of individual freedoms where it doesn't interfere with anybody else's freedom. That's been the very heart and nature of liberalism. And I think that's where he got himself into a tangle. I mean, I approve of most of his other political views on most other things, but there was a conflict there that he wouldn't have found, I think, in the Tory party, even though he would probably have been conflicted with them on almost everything else.
That's interesting. I mean, you kind of make the case in the book, don't you, Tim, that actually, in your view, to be a liberal is to be open to sharing space with people with different opinions. Not that those are forced, obviously, on anybody, but that people should be able to privately hold different perspectives. Obviously, though, in your case, that proved too much for many people, or at least it was, in the national media, it was spun out. So obviously issues around sexuality, but as obviously as Polly has mentioned, your issues on abortion and euthanasia didn't come into it particularly, but again, it could be argued that on some of those things, on your personal Christian belief level, you're out of step with, let's say, the majority of the population.
I think it's more that, that's probably absolutely true, because Christianity always is and always should be countercultural. And it's not my only reason for being opposed to there being an established church, but first of all, a church that is a prisoner of the state tends to be ineffective in its mission, which is to share the gospel and to do so compellingly. But Christianity is ultimately and utterly countercultural, the sense that, for example, for those of us like me who seek to live our lives as best we can in obedience to what the Bible teaches us, we don't do that because we're kind of tugging our forelock to a foreign power and just doing what we're told by a different kind of chief whip, which is very often an issue. It's been, in many ways, that's the core of the critique, I don't know how, certainly in an illiberal and intolerant critique of Catholics, I'm not one, that they owe their allegiance to a foreign power, and other minorities are also come under that threat, shall we say, in recent times as well. So it's not as though we're tugging our forelock to some ancient tome, but there is a different worldview. If you think that there's more than this, if you think that actually C.S. Lewis talks about the fact that you've never met a mortal being, everybody's an eternal being, and therefore the context of forever is the critical difference. That we can be as successful as we like in this life, but it's of no relevance whatsoever in terms of the long term. And what to me, I mean, I first of all, the Liberal Party came into being essentially to defend the rights of religious minorities and to defend religious freedom. And it was mostly, but not entirely, what you'd call evangelical Christians who headed that up. Any old liberal can defend people that any old fascist can defend people that they agree with. But it takes a liberal to stand up and challenge for those the rights of those who they don't. And so it should be no surprise the liberal movement, which obviously also birthed the early Labour Party as well, didn't just champion the rights of Methodists and Baptists and evangelicals, but also Catholics and Jewish people, and the small number of Muslims that were in the UK then, and women's rights, and all sorts of other groups who had no faith whatsoever, who literally did have not access to either voting rights or property rights, or the right to go to university, and all of those things. So in a sense, my liberalism absolutely fits with my faith, because I'm understanding that I live in a world with competing worldviews, and I want to be able to defend other people's rights to be who they are, and in return to have people defend my rights too.
What's your thoughts on that, Polly?
Well, if you're not religious, these things are entirely mystifying. I can't understand. I mean, we know that Christianity can be interpreted almost any way you want. You look at the Dutch Reformed Church and their justification for apartheid for all those years. You look at the Catholic interpretation. You look at a lot of very liberal, small L liberal interpretations, where really people think you should be allowed to do what you like, and you can choose your quotation. You can choose "judge not that ye be not judged," and not to throw the first stone. So the idea that to be a Christian you have to be against homosexuality because of the mores of that particular time that got imbued into that particular book seems to me to be archaic and peculiar. And you have to look at morality as we see it now in the present day, and not refer back to some ancient edicts. You have to think, what is humane and kind? What is generous and forgiving and tolerant and decent in this age? And it is not to prevent people from their own natural states of being, such as being gay. Or forcing a woman to have a child against her will. That doesn't seem at all in keeping with how we see human life and human rights now. So I find Tim's trying to merge liberalism with his version of Christianity a real contortion. He does it quite eloquently, verbally, but it doesn't actually make any sense at all, because liberalism has to be letting everybody do what they want to do as reasonably as possible, as long as it doesn't harm other people. And that has to include the right to be what you are if you're born gay.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I think that is what liberalism is to a degree. It also, meanwhile, in its entirety, it is also about understanding people who think very differently to you. And I think, by the way, what you say about not being forced effectively to obey old rules and what have you, absolutely reminds me of the way Jesus operated and spoke. Much of the drama, if you like, set in the New Testament documents is centers around Jesus's challenge with the religious establishment, who had invented additional rules, shall we say, to those given in the commandments that meant that, for example, he couldn't heal or do good on a Sabbath, and he very much challenged those people. In the end, though, I think that, are there multiple interpretations of the Bible? I think is that there are X billion number of people on planet Earth, and we are all of us flawed and all of us flaky, and some of us capable of really quite unspeakably awful things, including some who do things in the name of religion, and some who don't. You know, I think of Stalin and Pol Pot and people who are avowedly atheistic who kill millions. And so it works all ways. What it tells us that human beings are, if we're being gentle, we'd say flawed and sometimes downright utterly wicked. I think really though, it's important to look at the Bible and to understand what it's actually trying to say to us. One of the things that really strikes me, if you look at John's Gospel, you can say the same about the others as well, they really present themselves as historical documents. And Jesus, so John talks, and this is a man who apparently was a witness at the cross. And he writes that there's lots more I could have written, but I've written what I have because I want you to know that Jesus Christ is Lord, and by believing in him, you can have life in his name. So it's very clear why he's written this. It's a polemic and it's a history. It's a biography. And it's also, the wonderful thing about the Bible is that the original documents are so early written that you don't need to worry about whether X tradition is right or Y tradition is right. You've pretty much got patient zero. You've pretty much got your original. You can check whether it is.
There are an awful lot of people who would say that ain't so.
Well, they might think that tradition is important to add to the Bible, but you've got these early fragments which are more reliable than any other classical documents in existence, in terms of the numbers of them, the early nature of their writing, and indeed some external reference points as well. So people who say that Jesus didn't exist, didn't preach, wasn't killed under Pilate, are kind of in the same territory people who say we didn't land on the moon. It's very obvious that those things happen. Now, did he rise from the dead? That's the critical thing. And if he did, there's a God, and we know his name. End of story. And if he didn't, then turn all the churches into soup kitchens. You know, there's no point to Christianity at all if Jesus didn't rise from the dead.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, all of that.
Can I just say, I think that's a very extreme position, because you might think, as a lot of Christians do, but not of your ilk, I think, that on the whole, the teachings were good, encouraged the best in people, and you don't need to be a literal believer in the resurrection to believe that it's a good thing, and people getting together to talk and think about how to run society on those lines is a good and decent thing to do, without having to believe, you know, in a rather Quakerish way, if you like, without having to believe in the miracles, the magic and the superstition, and the idea that if the resurrection didn't happen, then forget it, because it's all about how we personally survive after death. That seems to me very literal and very limited in the potential of how you might have made better use of the teachings that are there.
I mean, it's interesting perspective. I mean, given that we are, I mean, at the moment this goes out, there may be many more statues that have been taken down, and you know, it's quite possible. Quite a lot of the people whose statues are being removed, there's a balance sheet. I know very little about Colston, other than he was a slaver, and I'm sure he was right to have the statue should be removed. Whether it should be removed in the way it was is a different debate. But there's even talk about Gladstone. We're not going to go there, but various other people. And generally speaking, there's a balance sheet. They said some good things, they may have done some good things, they may have been very generous, and they did some awful things potentially. And the thing about Jesus is that it's hard to read what he says and just conclude this was a nice man who said some nice things. He was a colossal egomaniac. Hell is mentioned 12 times in the New Testament, 11 times from the lips of Jesus. And he talks about being the one who will judge. He talks about how he himself is God before Abraham was. I am equivalent with the Lord. It's hard with God Almighty. And it's hard to kind of really find a better way of looking at this than C.S. Lewis's trilemma, that he's either Lord, liar, or lunatic. And I find it hard to look at Jesus' words and think that's interesting, knowing that if it's not true, this guy is an absolute madman, or he's a very, very wicked person who's pulled off the world's most successful hoax.
What do you make of that, Polly?
Well, I mean, after all, nobody was writing down his words as he spoke them at all. And if you read about the works, this sort of serious historical works, interpretations of what he said, where they came from, a lot of them were tropes that were around at the time amongst a lot of preachers at the time. It's an amalgam of all sorts of things. if you want to believe in the literal existence of that person who said exactly those things in exactly that way and interpreted in the way that the New Testament interprets them, without any of the surrounding historical context, because most of them were writing long afterwards, when it was partly about the politics of the religion that was being brought into existence, you reduce it to something incredibly simplistic. What he said is true, end of story, regardless of all of the surrounding evidence about the context in which these books were written.
I think the thing is, though, that if you look at the New Testament documents, they're all written from a perspective of, this is true, we're telling you about stuff that happened. I mean, Luke sits down, there are very few people who write in the New Testament. There's a mixture of eyewitnesses and non-eyewitnesses. Luke is a historian, accompanies Paul, he's clearly met all or most of the disciples and Mary. So it's a very historical sort of method. So
well, that's by no means proven. It's part of the tradition that he met Mary, and it's, you know,
he doesn't refer to her. He doesn't refer to her, but he does refer to plenty of the other disciples. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Supposition that he met Mary, but it's not supposition that he was Paul's assistant and that he met Peter and all those kind of things. And I mean, there's all sorts of smoking guns, but in the end, it's very hard to look at a bunch of documents that are claiming something massive about the person of Jesus Christ. It's obvious this is what it's all about, and then to think that it isn't either a deliberate hoax or it must be true. And particularly when you think that Christianity, if history is written by the winners, and that's why we have the statues that we do, because at some point they were the winners. But history is written by the winners. Christianity wasn't the winner politically for another 300 or 400 years until Rome decided it was the state religion. At the point this was written, and pretty much the canon was finished, these were people who had every reason not to believe these things. The majority of people who wrote in the New Testament ended up being killed for what they believed, and they knew firsthand that it was a load of rubbish, if it was a load of rubbish.
I'm really enjoying the historical debate here. It's marvelous, but perhaps the most prescient thing for Polly is the question of, well, regardless of what you think about the historicity of these documents, the question is, what do people do with them, you know, in the now? And I don't know, you've probably both seen, I'm sure, and probably written on that picture of Donald Trump holding a Bible outside a church in Washington, D.C. And inevitably, you know, religion and scripture and the Bible does get invoked for political purposes at some point. Now, I don't know what your reaction was to that, Polly, seeing that picture. Did it sort of cement for you, you know, your concerns around the way religion is wielded by some people in politics these days?
I think it cemented a lot of people's view of Trump as the ultimate poser and hypocrite. I think it probably offended Christians, genuine Christians, more than it would offend us unbelievers for a use and abuse of their beliefs. As far as I was concerned, I mean, my jaw dropped along with everybody else, and I thought how absurd. But I think that, yes, I think the use of Christianity for good and evil is interesting. I don't think those of us who are humanists and not religious have ever claimed to be either morally inferior or morally superior. We don't think religion makes people better or worse. It can do either. I don't think that it's a signifier for virtue or good intent. I mean, most charitable acts are done by people who are not religious. Some of the religious people do good charitable acts. It's, you know, there's always a way of pointing, of saying, oh, look, you know, the Trust runs food banks, and isn't it great because they're essentially a Christian organisation? They are great, they're wonderful. But then, you know, there are huge numbers, there's Oxfam and any number of other charities you can point to that have nothing to do with religion. And so I think we should leave virtue out of it, whether it leads to good works or not. I think the theme of this discussion has been to make sure that religion doesn't interfere with political policy making on key issues, or if it does, it should be absolutely transparent, and people with those religious beliefs who are proclaiming them in order to affect a particular law or then I think they should declare it. I think they should say.
I mean, would you, though, in the same way ask an atheist to declare their, if you like, worldview, because they perhaps don't believe we're going anywhere after we die, and therefore that informs the way that they think about, something like euthanasia or abortion, whereas a Christian may think, actually, no, we have some kind of eternal nature to us, and therefore we can't treat life in this way. Are all worldviews required to kind of lay their cards on the table in that way in politics?
Well, I think possibly. I mean, I think if it's becoming not true of lots of issues, it's only a limited number of issues in this country anyway, where religion might obtrude in any particular way. But I think where it is the edict of the particular faiths on right to die, on abortion, on contraception, on these things, on gay rights, where there's a possibility that somebody is speaking out of religious orthodoxy of whatever their religion is, I think it's better for them to declare it. And of course, atheists to say, look, I have no religious belief, and this is where I'm coming from. Because we've had a lot of hidden religion. I mean, Elora Finlay, who has been the great champion against abortion time and time again in the House of Lords, has never proclaimed that she's a Catholic, though she is. And has, there have been an awful lot of people who've and messages have gone out amongst Catholics. Say, don't tell anybody, don't say that's where you're coming from, because it'll make you less believable. Well, I think it does a bit if people think, well, the church is told to say this.
Okay. Tim, respond to that. Feel free to. And obviously, it'd be interesting in your response to seeing Trump there with a Bible in hand as well.
Yeah, two massive issues here. We'll take them back to front. And I think the key thing I would say, I mean, should people out themselves as being a religious believer beforehand? Well, from a Christian point of view, you're not meant to keep your head down. Don't be a fool. Martyrdom is not a thing to go and seek, because that's a vain and stupid thing. But you certainly should be publicly open about your faith, whilst not, ramming it down anybody's throat. I think the issue, though, is I want to just challenge is the kind of myth of secular neutrality. I'm a secularist in the sense that I believe that no one faith or religion should be given primacy in the politics, and certainly the pollution of the Christian faith has an awful lot to do with its being the furniture of the state in those places where it has been so. So I think it's good for Christianity either, for what it's worth. But it is a myth to think that the absence of faith is neutral. The fact is there is no neutrality. And I suspect where we're getting to now, we may have an established church. In fact, it feels more like that's the opposite is the case, that the established position is a presumption of non-belief. And we will tolerate you if you believe, but you are at best a bit eccentric. And so, I mean, I'm not offended by that, certainly not as a Christian. As a liberal, I find it a bit awkward, because I think the assumption that a worldview has primacy is just not, it's not very clever, and it's not liberal. So I think secular neutrality, it's a myth. There is no neutrality. Everybody's partial. Trump massively offends me for loads of reasons, but not least the way, and my criticism is not so much of him, because he's him. My criticism and my beef is with the leaders of white evangelical Christianity in the United States, who are giving the gospel a bad name. There are millions of people with their fingers in their ears when it comes to the gospel, which I've made a half-baked attempt at doing. I think there are strong, rational reasons, as well as deep emotional and spiritual reasons, why you should put your trust in Jesus Christ. And there's millions of people not paying the slightest bit of attention to him, because the association of white evangelical Christianity in the States with that fundamentally wicked man who is in the White House. So, that doesn't mean you can't vote Trump and be a Christian. Your judgment is up to you to make that decision. But his appropriation of the evangelical movement, the white evangelical movement, I should add, in the United States, has been hugely damaging to Christianity and to the promotion of the gospel. So I'm unsurprised by Trump and quite cross with my brothers and sisters over the pond.
Well, it sounds like, Tim was more offended than you were, Polly, by Trump's particular photo op there. But coming back to Tim's point, and we'll just have a minute on this, and then we'll go to our final break and a quick wrapping up. The myth of neutrality, he says, let's not pretend that simply excluding faith from the table, if as it were, means that we're sort of in this sort of secular neutrality, that everyone's bringing something to bear, and maybe that's not being owned up to, perhaps, by the secular lobby and so on. That it's not just a neutral space anymore.
Well, it's not neutral in the sense that, you mean, anybody who's not religious, we could be anything at all. To be not an evangelical or not a Catholic or not a Muslim, it still allows you to be, goodness knows, a far right conservative, a far left Labour person. It isn't really a state of being, it's a state of not being. And there isn't anything really that unites the secular beyond not being religious, which is a pretty small identity. I mean, we're all within that, a vast identity. It isn't a thing, really. It's, for most people, normal not to have religion in their lives. A few people do have it. And for those who don't, we will fight away like anybody else about all of our disagreements about just about everything else.
But I suppose Tim's point, as I understood it, is that why ask a Christian to sort of keep their faith under wraps, in a sense, in the public life, when everyone else is bringing their own ideologies to play, whether they be Christian or it may be some other political ideology or some other way of looking at life. That's just who we are, is what I understand Tim to be saying. And you can't sort of say, Christians, you're not allowed to sort of use put your faith out there in ways that are going to potentially have an impact on public life for those who don't share your faith, when everyone's doing that with whatever point of view they're coming from.
Except mostly in politics, they're out there. There's Michael Gove, there's Jeremy Corbyn. There are all these people who have their own belief systems on their sleeve, and we can like them or not like them. We can fight with them, argue with them. But the fact that they're probably, I don't know, perhaps Michael Gove is, he certainly pretends to be, because he sends his daughter to a C of E school, so he must have at some point got down on his knees to get her in. But otherwise, most people, it's just a sort of thing that isn't there. They get on with disputes and arguments. It's not that we all indeed have our own passionate belief systems, and a lot of them probably not very rational either. That's certainly true, but in expressing yourself as a politician, you will express those beliefs. It's that you shouldn't sort of hide something that maybe is a motivator. I mean, in the sense that you shouldn't, in the old days, people on the left shouldn't have hidden that they were communists and being often their organizations funded from Moscow. I mean, that was disgraceful. But mostly, most of us, we may be only semi-aware of our motivations, but we're out there putting forward our case without anything to hide, really.
We're going to go to our final break. We'll be back in just a moment, concluding today's show on Do Faith and Politics Mix?
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Brierley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
I've really enjoyed today's discussion on faith and politics. Tim Farron and Polly Toynbee have been my guests today. Polly, thank you very much for giving some time today. As you said, you're not looking to out people, to get rid of Christians in politics. It's obviously the key for you is that their influence is not beyond what it should be in terms of their actual representation in the UK. You've written this book, which obviously paints a somewhat pessimistic picture of the last 10 years. Do you see faith as being part of the next decade in any significant way when it comes to politics and our culture, or do you think actually we'd be better with less and less of it, as it were?
Well, it's certainly on a very fast decline. In the last decade, as you read out, it has declined very fast, and I think it will again. The younger you are, the less religious you are. So I think it's going to become less and less important. It will become, of course, all the more important to make sure that we defend the rights of minority religions to hold their beliefs and to be protected in their right to hold their beliefs and to practice their particular forms of worship or whatever it might be. But I think it makes it all the more important that we make sure that that Parliament is representative of women, of people of colour, of different races, of different religions, but not overbalance, as we do at the moment, many more people of religion than there are in society as a whole.
Tim, final thoughts from you. What's your view? Do you think that politics is becoming a less welcome place for people of faith? That obviously was your experience of leading your party. I don't know what your thoughts are on how things are now and going forward into this new decade.
I'm not sure, really. I think that we can be, if we're not careful, too quick to think of the world just through very British eyes or even Western eyes. And if you look at the planet as a whole, there have never been more Christians on planet Earth than there are today. And the growth of belief in Jesus Christ in Latin America, in Asia, China in particular, Africa and so on, as well as significant growth in certain parts of the church in the West as well, is a phenomenon that people can't explain away. There does appear to be a correlation between the wealthier that we are, the more distractions we have, the less we seem to have time for God. That does seem to be a correlation. And I guess for me, what I don't want people to think is that those who are in politics who are Christians, or indeed Christians anywhere else, are there so that we can slavishly, in some kind of thoroughly dull kind of way, live our lives in accordance with some ancient text which just holds us back. We're talking about a relationship with a human being. What we bring to the table, everybody, atheist or Christian or whatever, brings faith to the table because we trust in something, whether it's in our own strength and our own power, our own relevance, or someone else. So we have a hope that we bring to the table that, particularly in the middle of a coronavirus, is in short supply. But we also hold out relationship. It's not an old book. It's a current live person that we're offered a relationship with. And the evidence is the point where you bring the horse to the water. And the question is, are you prepared to trust enough to drink and find out whether Jesus Christ is real and real today?
It's been great having you both on the programme. Thank you very much for giving up some time. Just want to mention briefly again, A Better Ambition is the book by Tim, and Polly Toynbee's book, co-authored with David Walker, is The Lost Decade. I'll make sure there are links from today's show. For the moment, Polly and Tim, thank you very much for being with me on today's show.
Brilliant. Lovely to see you both.
Thank you. Bye, Tim.
God bless. Thanks, Polly. Bye, Justin. Bye-bye.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.